start a new topic, which is chapter 7 in the book. It's the Gaussian free field on ZD. Gaussian free field on ZD. We will not spend too much time on this model. We'll finish it next week, probably even only part of next week. My goal is more just to, I want to define the model. I want to state some basic properties and keep it at that. The idea is that you are going to see more about this topic in the second semester in other lectures. Okay. So what is the Gaussian free field? I first define it and then I give some motivation where it comes from and so on. And I'll construct it the same way we constructed the Ising model. So let's start with defining the set of configurations of the model. So in the Ising model it was plus or minus 1 at each vertex of ZD. Here you put at each vertex of ZD a real number. So the set omega is R to the ZD. The basic random variables in the same way. So I take some configuration omega in capital omega, and then I can define a random variable which I will denote by phi I. So phi I of omega is just omega I, exactly as we did in the Ising model. We called them in sigma I in the Ising model. Now the random variable, I want to call them phi I. It's more standard notation. And these I will call the spin at I. As in the Ising case, or the height at I. The reason for this terminology will be clear in a few minutes. Okay. So now, second so that's the set of configuration. Now I need to define the energy of a configuration so that I can construct the Gibbs measure. So let me define the Hamiltonian of the GFF. Hamiltonian in a finite box lambda in ZD. So it will be a function defined on omega, which depends on two parameters. So let's beta will be again a non-negative real number, which will be the inverse temperature. And I need a second parameter, which I will denote by n. And this will be also equal to 0. And I will call it the mass. Okay. So with these two parameters, I can define the Hamiltonian as follows. So h lambda beta m of a configuration, okay, as a function. H is just the sum over all pairs of nearest neighbors in the lattice. So again, I will denote it. Remember, this is the set of all edges in lambda, or between nearest neighbors, or also between a vertex in lambda and its neighbor outside lambda, if there is one. And then I want, okay, the normalization will look a bit strange, but it will be very convenient later on. So beta over 4d, d is just the dimension of the lattice. Okay. And then I want here to have phi I minus phi j square. So that's the first term. And the second term is m square over 2. Again, the 2 will be convenient later on, and the square also. Sum over all I in lambda. Phi I square. Okay, so that's the Hamiltonian. That's the energy that you associate to a given configuration. And maybe just a couple of words about the effect of these two terms. So obviously, if you want to have a low energy, we have seen that the Gibbs measure gives higher weight to configuration which have low energy. So to have a low energy, you want both terms to be small. So when this term is small, I mean, for this term to be small, you need all these gradients, phi I minus phi j, between nearest neighbors I and j, to be small. Okay? So this term has a tendency to make the gradient small, so a vertex has to take a value which is close to the values of its neighbors. Okay? And this term has to, I mean, the role of this term is to make everybody small. I mean, because of the phi I square, you want all the heights here to be close to 0. So these are the effects of these two terms. This term will play an important role also. So this one, when it's not there, we use a specific terminology. So when this guy is absent, when m is equal to 0, we talk about the massless GFF. Okay. And when m is non-zero, then we call about massive GFF, and we'll see that these two cases have completely different behavior. So this one has a much wilder behavior than this one. Okay. So what can happen when m is 0? So this term is not there. So one might expect that, okay, since everybody has to be close to its neighbor, this should be enough to keep the field small without adding this term, but that's not the case, because even though all the gradients are very small, so if you take, say, the model with zero boundary condition and all the gradients are very small, you can still, when you add all these gradients to construct the value of the field in the center of the box, the sum of all the gradients can be very large, even if all the gradients are very small. And this will happen, at least in low dimensions. This is something that will happen, and that will make the spin in the middle of the box, or any spin at finite distance from the middle of the box, to fluctuate in an unbounded way as the size of the system goes to infinity. So we'll see that later on. So this term will regularize the behavior in a very important way. Okay, so that's for the Hamiltonian. Once you have the Hamiltonian, you can define the Gibbs measure as usual. So Gibbs measure in lambda, okay, at parameters beta and m. So it's a probability measure. I will see it, there are several ways to see it. I will see it as a probability measure on r to the lambda. So it's a probability measure on r to the power lambda, given by, of course, with the usual Borel sigma algebra, given by the following. So my notation is mu lambda beta m, and then I take some boundary condition eta. So eta omega is a boundary condition as we saw in the Ising model, same type of thing. And the probability it gives to an event A is just okay, say the integral of E minus the Hamiltonian beta m of omega, say, is properly normalized, so I need again the partition function beta m eta. Let me write it here like that. So I will write omega lambda eta lambda complement. So what this notation means, this is a configuration, so the configuration omega lambda eta lambda complement, so that's a configuration. And it's defined by omega lambda eta lambda complement at I is omega I if I is in lambda, and it's eta I if I is not in lambda. Okay, so it's just the configuration of omega inside the box, eta outside the box. Okay, and then okay, I want to check that the event is satisfied, and then I just have the product over I in lambda of the omega I. These are just Lebesgue measures. Okay. So that's the probability that you associate to an event. You just, it's the analog of what we saw in the Ising model. It has a density which is basically E minus the Hamiltonian. You have to properly normalize it by the partition function. Okay, I think that, okay, maybe let me just write the partition function. So, time eta. It's just the integral of e minus h lambda beta m omega lambda eta lambda complement product I in lambda d omega I. Okay. Good. Now, a simple exercise, but important to do, just to check that things are well defined. It was trivial in the Ising model, it's not completely trivial here. It's exercise 7.3 and 7.5, which I will mix in the book. It's not completely immediate that this quantity is always finite. You have to check it, in particular when this guy is, the mass term is not here. Okay, just check it. So prove. It's easy, but do it. So z lambda beta m eta is finite for any eta in omega and any beta strictly positive and any m greater or equal 0. Okay, this is always a well-defined quantity. If it was not, then we could not even define the measure. I mean, I cannot normalize it. It would be a problem. So this is an important observation to make. And second important observation, related observation to make, if you remember in the Ising model, we introduced this similar type of boundary condition where we put configuration, frozen configuration outside the box, but we also considered another type of boundary condition, which was the free boundary condition. Okay. Here you cannot do that. Why you cannot do that? Because in the if you define free boundary condition in the natural way, so in the Hamiltonian you just restrict the sum over all edges which are inside the box lambda, of the same type of things, then it's very easy to check, and I let you check that. So the partial function with free boundary condition defined in the natural way, when m is equal to 0, when there is no mass term, this quantity is always infinite. So, for all beta. So you cannot define the model with free boundary condition. In this case, it's kind of obvious because, okay, let me give you an intuition behind what this model is. Well, one of the possible interpretations of this model, the interpretation I will use in this course is as a random model for a random surface. Yes, what we call an effective interface model. And the idea is the following. So you can interpret the model as follows. So I'll draw again the one-dimensional case because I'm on a two-dimensional blackboard, but everything I say is true more generally. So this is just Z. Then say we have our box lambda here. That's the box lambda. We have some boundary conditions, so we are freezing the spins. So I'm drawing here the value taken by the spins. In this direction, I'm drawing the values taken by the spins. Okay. So this will be, if this is, say, k, this is eta k. Okay. And then you do it, you draw the heights at each. Okay, and so on and so forth. Something like that. And then this gives you a random line. Okay. You have a random line which is pinned at both endpoints, at the height given by the boundary condition. And at vertex I, this is just phi I. Okay, that's the height. So that's one interpretation of the model. It's a model of a random function from Z to R. But now if I replace Z by ZD, as we do here, say for Z2, for example, then you get a two-dimensional random surface defined over Z2 with some specified boundary condition outside the box lambda. So I will not try to draw the two-dimensional case. You have a picture in the notes. Okay. So that's one of the interpretations of this model. Now you see that if you put free boundary conditions, so if you remove this, and then there is no interaction between what happened inside the box and outside the box, then obviously this configuration of the interface I can push it up and down, and I'm not changing the energy if the second term is not here. Because if I push the interface up and down, so I'm adding some constant to C to phi I and the same constant C to phi j, then the difference here, the constant disappears. So the energy is preserved if I make vertical shift of the interface. And therefore, the interface, since it has an infinite amount of space to move upward and downward, it will just go to infinity immediately. So you cannot define the probability measure in this case. But okay, check it. Okay, so that was one thing. Another thing I wanted to say is that these two parameters, beta and h, that I introduced here, of these two parameters, at least one is irrelevant because I can just make a change of variables. So let's say, you see the first term, which is here, I can take the beta inside, or I can rewrite the Hamiltonian as h lambda beta m. I can write it also. So let's say this 1 over 4d, keep it here. But then I have the sum over all ij. And then I can put square root beta phi I minus square root beta phi j square. And then the second term, so it will be, let me do it like that, m over square root beta square over 2, sum over I in lambda square root beta phi I square. I've not changed anything, I've just moved things around. And then you can just change variable to these quantities everywhere in the integral here. Just change the variable. And you see that you can relate the model with parameters beta and m to the model with parameters 1 and m over square root of beta. So you can send m beta to m over square root of beta 1. Okay. And therefore, just there is no loss of generality if I assume that beta is 1. So we will always assume that beta is equal to 1. And I remove beta from the notation because I don't want to write 1 everywhere if it plays no role. Okay. So this I will always do. From now on, there is only one parameter, it's the mass, and the temperature is just always 1. It plays no role in the model. Okay, so where does this model come from? So the terminology, Gaussian free field, I mean, as you can guess from the free field part, it comes from quantum field theory. It's the basic model on top of which you construct more interesting field theories. Maybe Hugo mentioned phi-4 and things like that. They are all constructed as, in a sense, perturbation of this Gaussian free field. So that's the building block. You start with this, and then you add more complicated interaction on top of it, and you study the effect of these more complicated interactions. So that's one of the motivations for the model. There are many others. Recently, one of the main motivation to study this model, and the one you will see during the second semester, during several lectures in the second semester, is that this GFF is, or actually the corresponding continuous quantity. So you can take a scaling limit as the mesh of the lattice ZD goes to 0, and you get the analog of this object defined in the continuum. And this continuum GFF plays a very important role in relation with critical properties of critical systems, especially in dimension 2. And these are things that will be explained during the second semester. For me here, since this is a course on statistical mechanics, the motivations are basically twofold. One of the motivations is this one. The GFF has been introduced as the simplest possible, in a sense, model of a random surface, of a random interface. Say maybe you have the minus phase of the Ising model here and the plus phase of the Ising model here. You want to model the interface between the two. It's a very difficult problem in general, but then you can take this as a caricature of what happens for this interface, and that's one of the possible models. And it has been studied a lot from this point of view. And another interpretation in statistical mechanics of this Gaussian free field is as a model which describes the small fluctuations of the position, say, of atoms in a crystal. So you have a crystalline structure, and then the atoms, because temperature is non-zero, they will fluctuate around their equilibrium position. And that's also a simple model of this situation. In this case, it's not called the GFF. Usually, in this case, it's called the harmonic crystal. So if you find somewhere this terminology, is just the GFF. Okay, it's the same object. Okay, so that's all I wanted to say for this introductory part. And now let's move on to the main thing I want to explain in this chapter, which is the random walk representation. Okay, and the goal is the following. So in Gaussian free field, where does the word Gaussian come from? Well, it's pretty obvious. If you look at the measure, which is here, the measure is E minus a function, which is a quadratic function of the phi I. Okay? You have E minus some quadratic function of the phi, the variable phi. So this measure is just a Gaussian measure. Okay? That's just obvious. It's a Gaussian measure. And since it's a Gaussian measure, you know, or you will do that in the exercises, Gaussian measure is entirely characterized by its mean and by its covariance matrix. Okay? So it would be quite convenient if we could find nice expressions for the means of the spins and covariance between the spins under this measure. And that's exactly what we are going to do. So and what is the simplest way, if you have a Gaussian measure, to compute its mean and covariance matrix is just to put the measure in the canonical form. So the usual form. So we want to rewrite the measure mu lambda. Okay, beta, I said it disappeared. Mu lambda m eta in the canonical form. Canonical form, by which I mean just 1 over 2 pi, it was lambda. Lambda over 2, then you have the square root of the determinant of some matrix G lambda, and then you have exponential of minus, say, I'm just writing the density, so the density will be, say, at x, it will be x minus u, scalar product, some matrix G lambda minus 1, applied to x minus u. Okay, so that's the standard form of the standard form for the density of a Gaussian random vector. Here you have the mean, and here you have the inverse of the covariance matrix. So if I can rewrite this density, E minus this guy, in this form, then I can just read from the expression both the mean and the covariance matrix of the model. So that's what we want to do. So let me just try. So U is just Ui, say I in lambda or I in ZD, whatever, both are possible. Where Ui is just the expectation under this measure lambda m eta of phi I, and G lambda ij, the ij element of the matrix G lambda is just the covariance under the measure lambda m eta of phi I and phi j. Okay. So my aim is to compute these quantities, and I will do that by putting the measure in under this form. Okay. So to do that, let me start by some very simple algebra, but a bit painful, but we have to do it. You see, the main thing, here I have a gradient. It's really a discrete gradient. I have a discrete gradient a bit of the field phi at ij, okay, square. And what you would like to do when you have a gradient phi, you would like to replace this by phi Laplacian phi, or minus phi Laplacian phi. So you want to make some integration by part or summation by part because everything is discrete here. So I want to state and prove some summation by part formula which will be useful because we have to be careful with the boundary terms here. So let me introduce the necessary formulas. So it's A1, discrete green identities. And harmonic function. So let's consider some collection F equal Fi, I in ZD. It's a collection of real numbers, so it's an element of R to the ZD. Okay. And then I want to define the following quantities. So for any, say, Ij, which belong to the edges of ZD, I define gradient F Ij, just the discrete gradient at the edge Ij, it's just f of j, fj minus fi. Okay. And I also want to define for any I in ZD, I want to define the discrete Laplacian. Let me write it like that. At I, this will just be the sum over all j neighbor of I of the gradient f ij. Okay. These are two quantities, so this is discrete gradient, discrete gradient, and discrete Laplacian. Okay, so maybe let me also write it down explicitly once. So this is really the sum over all j neighboring I fj minus 2dfi. Okay, I also need it under this form. Okay, so now we want to prove the following very simple formulas. Very simple but very useful. We'll use them in this chapter, of course, but also in the next two chapters, I guess. That's why I want to do it properly. So it's lemma 714 in the book. Lemma 714 tells you the following. So let lambda be a finite subset of ZD. Then, for any collection F and G of real numbers, as before, we have the following two identities. Let me call them DG1, discrete green identity 1 and 2. So the first one tells you that the sum over all Ij in all the edges which are inside lambda or connect lambda to the lambda complement of gradient f Ij gradient G Ij, this is equal to the sum over all I in lambda, so minus the sum over all I in lambda, say Gi Laplacian f I. So I've made the summation by part. I've moved this gradient here, which gives me the Laplacian with a change of sign. But then there is a boundary term. And the boundary term, it takes this form, so it's a sum of all I in lambda, j not in lambda, I and j neighbors. Okay. And then it will be, let me not make it wrong, so gj gradient f ij. I want to have the signs correct. I have to be careful. And then let's state a second identity of this type. The second one is can be written as follows. So sum over all I in lambda fi, the discrete Laplacian of g at I, minus gi, discrete Laplacian of f at I. So I move from this guy to this guy by moving the Laplacian, so I'm making two summations by part. So this should be, this should just give me some boundary term. And indeed, that just gives you a boundary term. The boundary term is the sum over all I in lambda, j not in lambda, I and j neighbors of the following expression. You have fj, fi gradient j, ij, minus dj gradient f ij, and that's all. Okay. So these are the two formulas I would like to establish, and then everything will follow easily from these formulas. I could let them as an exercise, but since I will use them several times now and in the sequel, I prefer to do that. So let's prove this. And I will start with the first one. We'll start with this expression. So we have the sum over all ij gradient fij gradient g ij. And this is convenient to decompose it into two terms. The first one will be the sum over all edges ij, which stay inside the box lambda. So they belong now to E lambda. So I'm removing all those which connect some vertex in lambda with some vertex outside lambda of the same expression. Gradient f ij, gradient g ij, and then I have to add something. So the something I have to add will be sum over all I in lambda, j not in lambda, I and j neighbors, and gradient f ij, gradient g ij. Okay. So let's start this way. And now I will focus my attention on this term. So things are much nicer for this term than this one, because this is completely symmetric in I and j, which is not the case here. Well, you'll see. So I continue the computation here, but I will return here later. So let me focus a little bit on this guy. So that's the sum over all I, j, edges of lambda, so gradient f ij, gradient g ij. And let's see what we can say about this guy. So this you can, for example, just use the definition of the discrete gradient. So this is just the sum over all ij in lambda, and then I get gj gradient f ij minus the sum over all ij lambda gi gradient f ij. Just use the fact that this is gj minus gi. Then the first sum here, maybe I will change color. Green, say. This first sum here, I can rewrite it as, I can just interchange I and j. They are just summation variables, so it doesn't change anything. So I get gi gradient f ji, not done anything, but then gradient f ji is just minus gradient f ij. So this is also minus sum over all ij in E lambda ji gradient f ij. And we recognize here exactly the term we have here with the same sign. So this is, the whole is equal to minus 2 sum over all ij in E lambda gi gradient f ij. And now I want to write it as follows. So now instead of summing over edges like that, I will sum first over the vertex I and then over its neighbors. So I get sum over all I in lambda gi. There is a minus for sure. Gi. And then I have sum over all j in lambda, j neighbor I. Okay. And then I get gradient f ij. Now, this guy is almost the discrete Laplacian at I. But the 2 has disappeared because when I sum over I and j, I will also have the term j and I as another term in the sum, so it will give me the 2. So this guy here is almost the Laplacian of f at I. But I have to remove something. I have to remove all j which are not in lambda, j neighboring I, and the same thing, gradient f ij. Okay. So this gives me what I want. So this gives me, in the end, this gives me, for this term, it gives me minus sum over I in lambda, gi Laplacian f at I, which is the term I want to extract in the formula. It's the first term here. And then we have some correction, which is, okay, the plus, because of these two minus, sum over all j not in lambda, j neighbor of I, of gi gradient fij. Okay, so that's what we get for this term here. So I can just substitute here, and what we get for this expression here, I get this minus sum over I in lambda gi Laplacian f at I. Then I get this term, which is plus sum over all, say, I in lambda, j not in lambda, I neighbor of j, gi, and then I have gradient f ij, and then I also have this term here. So if you look, so I'm summing over the same things. The gradient fij is also here, so let me put it together. So I have gi plus, yes, it's correct, gradient g ij. Okay. But now what is this thing? So gradient g ij is gj minus gi plus gi. This is just gj. Okay. And that gives us the first formula. Okay. So that's dg1. So not very exciting computation, but okay, let's to do it. The second discrete green identity is much simpler because it's a direct consequence of the first one. Let's move to the second one. Well, what you do is that you take the first, so what does the first discrete green identity tell you? It tells you that sum over all ij in E lambda b, gradient f ij gradient g ij. This is just the sum of minus the sum of all I in lambda gi Laplacian f I plus this boundary term I in lambda j not in lambda I neighboring j gj gradient fij. Okay. But this is completely symmetric in f and g. So I can also just interchange the role of f and g, and I get a second identity. I get that this is also minus the sum of all I in lambda, fi Laplacian g I plus sum over all I in lambda, j not in lambda, I neighboring j of fj gradient g ij, and that's just the second discrete green identity. So if you move this guy on the other side, this guy on the other side, you just get this identity. Okay. So it's really just saying that this is equal to that. Okay, so that's pretty elementary, but it will be very, very useful to us. Maybe I will let them on the board for a while. So some notation that I will need. Maybe I can even put them here. So I want to introduce, to see the Laplacian as an operator on Z2, ZD. So let me just write this as follows. So notation, I will write Laplacian f at I. So by definition, it's the sum over all j gradient f ij, but I want to write it as the sum over all j in ZD of Laplacian ij fj. Okay, so what should this delta ij be? If you want this to be an identity, so I have to define this to be minus 2d if I is equal to j. I have to put plus 1 if I is a neighbor of j, and 0 otherwise. And then this sum just gives me exactly the same thing as this sum. So that's the first notation I need. And the second notation I need is to see this as, I mean, if I give myself a finite set lambda, I would like to look at the restriction of this to the set lambda. So I will denote it by delta lambda. So delta lambda will be the collection delta ij with ij in lambda. Okay. In particular, I will write so f delta lambda. Particularly, we have that f delta lambda g, which is just by definition the sum over all I in lambda fi delta lambda g I, and if I just write what this is just the sum over all I in lambda, j in lambda, so say ij in lambda, fi delta ij gj. Okay. And we see immediately that because this delta ij, the way I defined it here, it satisfies delta ij equal delta ji, it's symmetric. So you immediately see that f, the scalar product between f and the Laplacian of g is the same as the scalar product of g with the Laplacian in lambda of f. So we have this identity, which will also be useful to us in a minute. Good. So now let's use this to achieve our goal, which is to rewrite the density of the GFF in the canonical form. So remember that the first term in the Hamiltonian, so the most complicated term in the Hamiltonian has the following form: is the sum over all ij of say E lambda b of something like fi minus fj or say fj minus fi square. Okay, there is some prefactor. I don't care about the prefactor. I want to find some formula for this expression. Okay. So the first term was the sum of the gradient square. So this is just the sum ij in E lambda b gradient f ij square. Okay. So f here is as before. F is just a collection fi in zd of real numbers. And I will assume that f outside the box lambda, so I'm giving myself some finite set lambda. And outside this set lambda, I want f to agree with the boundary condition eta. So I want to have fi equal to eta I for all I not in lambda. Okay. That's the kind of object I have to work with when I'm looking at the Gibbs measure. So that's what I want to assume. So in the Gibbs measure, the first term has this particular structure, so I can write it like that, and then you immediately recognize a particular case of this expression when f is equal to g, so I can apply the first discrete Green identity here, and this gives me, so that's dg1. This gives me immediately minus I in lambda, fi, Laplacian f I, okay, plus the boundary term, sum over all, I in lambda, j not in lambda, I and j neighbors, fj gradient f ij. Okay. And now let's rewrite that somehow. So this is easy. So of course this is just fj square minus fij. Okay, nothing much. Using definition of the gradient. This thing here, I would like to make this Laplacian lambda appear because it has the nice property that I want. So when you write your Gaussian measure in the canonical form, what you have is so x minus the mean times the inverse of some matrix times x minus the mean. So I would like to have a symmetric matrix here in the middle, and this one at least is a symmetric matrix with elements in lambda. So that makes more sense than this object. So this I would like just the Laplacian which is here. I would like to rewrite it as delta lambda of f at I. So I'm making a mistake when I'm doing that, of course, because delta lambda is just, so I should write it maybe somewhere. So in particular, delta lambda of f at I, it's the sum over all j in lambda, j neighboring I, or say, let me just do it like that, j in lambda f, say, delta ij, fj. Okay. So what I'm missing compared with the other expression, which is here, is just the sum over all j which are not in lambda. Okay. So this here I have to add the sum over all j which are not in lambda. And then for delta ij to be non-zero, j has to be a neighbor of I is in lambda, so j has to be a neighbor of I. And in this case, delta ij is just 1, so I just get here fj. Okay, so this is just equal to that plus this sum. So we arrive at, so this is equal to minus the sum over I in lambda. Okay, and then I get fi. Okay, I can write it shorter because I introduced the notation. This is really minus fi scalar product Laplacian lambda f. Okay, f scalar product Laplacian f. Okay, this is the notation I introduced just here. It's exactly the same thing as I get with the first term, and then I get some remainder. is a bit annoying, but let's see. So it will be minus sum over all I in lambda, j not in lambda, I and j neighbors. Then I get fi fj. Okay, from this guy. And then I get also something here. So I'm not super happy with this. Yes, no, it's okay. So here with a minus sign, here is also with a minus sign, so I get a minus 2. And then I still get a term with fj square. But now this last term, it only depends on the value of f outside lambda. Okay, because sum over all j which are not in lambda, fj square. So this sum here only depends on the value of f outside lambda, but this is deterministic. It's just given by eta. Okay, so this is just some boundary term that I don't care about, because when I will use this formula for our measure, I will get the same constant in the numerator and denominator, and they will just cancel. So I get plus some boundary term. So this is boundary term. Boundary term independent of the values of fi, I in lambda. Okay. Depends only on the boundary condition, nothing else. So this will play absolutely no role in our probability measure when I use the formula. So I will just ignore all these boundary terms. So that's something. So we made some progress. We already have that. But this is not in the right shape. What I want is not f some matrix times f plus some mess. I would like to have f minus something times the matrix times f minus something. So I want to rewrite it. We want something of the form f, say f minus u, f minus u. That's what we would like to have. I don't want something which has this shape. I want something which has this shape. Okay, where u is some just a collection of real numbers which depends on lambda and eta, depending only on lambda and eta. Okay, I would like to rewrite this in this form. Is there a question? Okay. So let's see, what should I do to rewrite this in this form? So let's see what this is equal to. So by linearity, I can write that f scalar product delta f. Okay. Then I have minus 2f delta u. And then I have plus u. I should write it like that. These are delta lambda, of course. Delta lambda u. Okay. I want to compare. So I have reproduced already this term, but let me just write the rest more explicitly. So this is f delta lambda f minus 2f, and here it will be convenient to have the real Laplacian, as you will see in a second. So this I want to, so again, this is just, okay, let me write it explicitly. So this is 2 sum over I in lambda, fi, and then I have Laplacian lambda u at I, plus, and the u does not depend on the value of fi in I in lambda, it only depends on the boundary condition, so it's some boundary term that I don't care about. And this guy here is Laplacian u I minus the sum over all j, not in lambda, j neighboring I, uj. Okay, I'm just correcting. Okay, now I can compare. I can compare the expression I got here with the expression I get here. So I see that this guy, which is here, I can, so minus this. So if I bring this guy on the right, on the left-hand side, and this expression on the right-hand side, I see that minus this is equal to minus that, which is nice, that's what I want, plus some mess. And then all this mess that I have here and there, I have to choose u in such a way that they cancel out. So let's see. So this implies that what we want, which is the sum over all ij in E lambda b, say fj minus fi square, this is equal to, so the term we want, which is minus f minus u scalar product delta lambda f minus u. So this one is nice. I'm happy to have it. So that's what I get when I substitute for this, the expression I get from this identity. But then I have to take into account all these corrections, so I get a minus, let's say minus 2 sum over I in lambda fi Laplacian u I, that's the term which comes from this one. Okay. Then I get this, which gives me a minus 2 sum over, so plus 2 because there is a minus 1, sum over I in lambda fi uj. And then I still have this term here, which gives me exactly the same type of sum. So I should write, so I in lambda, j not in lambda, j neighboring I. So it's exactly the same type of sums here and there, I have the same coefficient 2, I have the same fi. The only thing is that I have a minus fj now, so it's uj minus fj. Okay, plus boundary terms, which are irrelevant. Okay. And now I want to rewrite this term in this way. So these two guys have to be equal to 0. They should not be there. So I want this and this to be 0. And they have to be 0 whatever choice I make for fi, for the fi. Okay, so I have to choose u in such a way that these two terms are always 0. So this tells me something. It tells me that this quantity has to be equal to 0. Okay, it tells me that this quantity has to be equal to 0. I want them to vanish, so the only way I can make them vanish for all f is if this guy is equal to 0 and this guy is equal to 0. And if you do that, you see that the u, which will give them, in the end, which will give the mean of our Gaussian vector, satisfies the following set of equations. Okay, the u that I have to choose here, such that I have this identity, has to satisfy the following equation. Okay, I don't want this. So this implies that u has to satisfy the following. So what I will call dp0, Dirichlet problem, massless Dirichlet problem. It's the following thing. So I want to have Laplacian u I equal to 0 for all I in lambda. This makes the first term there to vanish. And then I want to have ui equal, so this I should stress maybe. So the fj, j is outside the box, so fj is just eta j. It's the boundary condition. So I want to have uj equal to eta j, uj equal to eta j for all j not in lambda. So this is just a Dirichlet problem. Say massless Dirichlet problem in lambda with boundary condition eta. It's telling you that you are looking for a function which has some prescribed boundary condition at the boundary of lambda or outside lambda, and it's harmonic inside lambda. So this u is harmonic in lambda. Good, so it's not completely clear a priori. I mean, maybe you've already done that in 10,000 courses, but a priori it's not completely clear that such a system has a solution and that it's unique. So we'll show just after the break, we'll make the break. We'll show that there is a unique solution, and then I will provide you a solution, explicit solution in a few minutes or next week. I don't know where we'll go. So to resume at, say, 25 past. Okay, we'll resume. So, as I said, I want to show that this, I will do it very quickly because I'm sure you have already seen it elsewhere, maybe even in our course. It's the fact that you have a unique solution for this equation, and then I will provide you with an explicit solution later, I hope today or next week. So, the uniqueness result is lemma 718 in the book. It tells you, okay, dp naught has at most one solution. Okay. And then we'll show that it has indeed one afterward. The proof is very very simple. One way to do it is to start with a particular case, which is a case where you have zero boundary conditions, so eta equals 0. So 1, the case eta identically equal to 0. So let's take some solution u. Let's assume there's a solution. So let u equal ui I in ZD be a solution. And we'll show that u is identically 0, so there is only one solution. Okay. So then let's denote by v star in lambda a vertex such that be such that u at v star in absolute value is maximal. Okay. You have some function, you look where inside the box lambda it takes the maximum value in absolute value. Without loss of generality, I can assume that actually uv star is strictly is non-negative. Okay. Why? Because otherwise, if u is a solution, minus u is also a solution, and then you consider minus u. If u was negative, then minus u is positive. Okay, so without loss of generality, I can assume that this is the case. Now, since u is a solution, we know that Laplacian u at I is equal to 0 for all I in lambda. Okay, so that means in particular that this happens at v star. So if I write it at v star, I have that the sum over all j neighboring v star of, let me write it, uj minus uv star. This has to be equal to 0. Okay. But now, by assumption, uv star is the maximal value that u takes inside the box lambda. So all these quantities, they are smaller or equal to 0. Okay. Because uv star is the maximal value, so this has to be smaller or equal to 0. And therefore, when I take when I sum numbers which are real numbers which are non-positive, and the sum is 0, this means that all the numbers are 0. So this means that uj is equal to uv star for all j neighboring v star. So if I have lambda somewhere, I have v star somewhere, then I know now, so here I have the maximal value that u takes, but I have the same value also taken on the neighbors of v star. But then I can repeat, I take, say, this guy, and I look at its neighbors, and by exactly the same argument, on all the neighbors, there's also to take the same value as here. And then you go on like that, okay, until, let me do it properly, until you reach a point which is next to the boundary, and you apply it once more, and you conclude that it takes the same value as all its neighbors, but these neighbors take value 0 because it's outside the box. So that means that everywhere I've put my crosses, I have zeros. So this means that u is identically 0. Okay? And therefore, there is only one solution. The solution is 0. Okay. So now let's consider the general case, the general boundary condition. Okay. But then it's immediate to reduce to the first case because you just take, say, let u and v be two solutions to the Dirichlet, massless Dirichlet problem with boundary condition eta. Then, say, h, which is equal to u minus v, is a solution to the Dirichlet problem, massless Dirichlet problem with zero boundary condition. Okay, with zero boundary condition. Okay. And we have seen in the first part that means that h is identically 0. That by the first part, h is identically 0, which means that u is equal to v. And therefore, if you have two solutions, they have to coincide, so there is at most one solution. Okay, so uniqueness is very easy. This, I don't know if no, I think I don't need it anymore today. Let me erase. So as I said, existence will be proved later. It will be proved later. Okay, so that was we just did algebra in the first part, but the goal was to rewrite the Gauss-Gaussian measure, the Gibbs measure in the canonical Gaussian form. So let's do it now. So let's apply what we have derived in the first hour of the lecture, and that's A2. And we'll do it first for the massless case. The massless case. Okay. So in this case, the Hamiltonian only has the part we have just analyzed. So we have that from lemma 717, we conclude that the Hamiltonian in lambda, so lambda as usual, lemma 717 implies that the Hamiltonian with mass 0, m is equal to 0, takes the following form. I can rewrite it as, so you remember in the Hamiltonian, the quadratic term, the gradient term are the 1 over 4d, which I choose, okay? 1 over 4d, I will write it in this way, so I have a 1/2 that I use now. I still have a 1 over 2d to use in a while. So this I can write as phi minus u times Laplacian in lambda. And okay, here I want it, so I need a minus 1 over 2d. That's the 1 over 2d that was missing. The minus sign comes from the formula which we get in 717, Laplacian lambda, applied to phi minus u. Okay. Plus boundary term. So that's what we did. We just showed that the Hamiltonian, when the mass term is not there, can be written as in this way. It will be very convenient for us to have this 1 over 2d here. That's why I put this strange normalization. Okay. Good. So now, what I would like to do, I still have two things to do. I have to identify U, but I also, here I don't want to have just a matrix. I want to compute the covariance matrix, and the covariance matrix is the inverse of this. So we want to invert this. Invert this matrix. Okay? So that once I've inverted it, I've explicited the covariance matrix of the field. Okay? So I want to inverse this, the Laplacian, discrete Laplacian. So I guess many of you have already done that, but I will do it explicitly also. So let's write delta lambda, so this matrix here, or say minus 1 over 2d delta lambda. Let's write it as follows. So I want to write it as I lambda minus p lambda, where I lambda is just the identity matrix in lambda, so it's just the delta ij in lambda, just the identity. Okay. And p lambda is a matrix with matrix element pij in lambda, where pij is equal to 1 over 2d if I and j are neighbors and 0 otherwise. So you immediately recognize for Pij the transition probability of the symmetric simple random walk on ZD. And these are the transition probabilities of symmetric simple random walk on ZD, which will play a very important role. Now, because what we are going to do is we are going to show that both the inverse of this matrix here, so the covariance matrix, and the mean U can be expressed in a very natural way in terms of the random walk. So. Okay, so let's write Xn will be the symmetric simple random walk on ZD. I will denote by Pi the law of xn started at I. Okay. Do I need other notation? I don't think so. No, that's all. So I will need just one very simple result about the simple random walk now, which I will prove. So it's lemma 720. The note tells you the following thing. So let lambda the finite subset of ZD. Let tau lambda C be the first time you exit the box, so the infimum overall n greater or equal to 0 such that xn is not in lambda. Okay. Then there exists a constant which depends only on the box lambda, okay, and on the dimensions. There exists a constant which is strictly positive such that the probability starting from, so for any I in lambda, the probability starting from I that the time it takes you to exit lambda is larger than n, this is smaller than E minus Cn. Okay? I want to prove that because I will need it to invert this matrix. Yeah. I will need this result. So the proof is completely immediate, what you do. So lambda is a finite set, okay? So I can define R will be the maximal distance I have to travel from any vertex in lambda to reach the boundary of lambda. So R will be the minimum overall j not in lambda of j minus I in one norm. So that's the minimal distance I have to travel to go from I, which is in lambda, to j, which is outside lambda. Okay? And then I take the worst of these lengths, so I take the max over I in lambda. Okay? So this tells me that from any point in lambda, in at most R steps, I can get out of lambda. Okay? Then, now the argument is very simple. What you do is if you have to wait a long time n, so that's of course for all n. Okay? If you have to wait a long time n, then what you will do is you split this time interval 0n into pieces of length r, and in each of these pieces you have a strictly positive probability of exiting the box, because wherever you are inside the box, you can just take the shortest path outside, which has a positive probability, and then you can exit. So the probability that tau lambda complement is larger than n, this is certainly bigger than. So what is the probability of not exiting on an interval of length r? This is 1 minus the probability of following the shortest path. The shortest path. This is the probability of following the shortest path. So the shortest path, why 2D, 2R? The shortest path has a length at most r. The probability of following it, it's 1 over 2D for each step. So that's the probability of following the shortest path. That's the probability of not doing that. Okay. And then I have to do that n over r times, say, integer part. Okay, that's just, and that's sorry, it's. What am I doing? Of course, it's like that. And then this is smaller than E minus C. Okay. For each time interval of length r, I have a strictly positive probability of, so this is strictly smaller than 1. Strictly positive probability of exiting the box. Okay. That's a trivial estimate, but it will be very useful to us now when we want to invert this, the Laplacian. Okay, so now I can state the first main result about this random walk representation, which is lemma 721. So I lambda minus P lambda, which I have just introduced, okay, this, which is just the operator we're interested in, the matrix we're interested in. This guy is invertible. And its inverse, we can actually compute it, and its inverse is given by, so G, which is a Gij, okay, G lambda Ij in lambda, Ij in lambda, okay. It's given by the following formula. So G lambda Ij, it's the expected number, okay. You take your random walk, which starts from I, you let it run until it exits the box, so just before it exits the box, actually, indicator that xn is j. So what is this? It's really computing the following things. So you have lambda, you have I somewhere, j somewhere else. You start your random walk at I, so it's traveling here, and you count the number of times it visits j before exiting the box. Okay. And this is just the expected number of visits at j starting from I before exiting the box. Okay. So that's what is called the green function in lambda of the symmetric simple random walk on ECT. Okay. So let's prove that. Proof? Well, first observe that we have the following trivial identity. So I lambda minus P lambda multiplied by I lambda plus P lambda square plus P lambda power n. So if you expand the product and you compute, everything cancels out except for I lambda and P lambda to power n plus 1. Okay, that's just completely trivial. Now, what is also P lambda n each time? So P lambda k is just the kth power of the matrix P lambda. Okay, so P lambda k Ij. This is just the sum. So I'm making k multiplication of my matrices. So I'm multiplying k matrices Pij. So it's the sum over I1, Ik minus 1. In lambda, and then I have P lambda I1, P lambda I1, I2, P lambda Ik minus 1, j. Okay, so just the definition of the power, case power of the matrix. And then now you can interpret this term. What is this? First, what is this? Product here, it's just the probability of the trajectory I1, I2, I3 up to j. Okay, it's probability of particular trajectory. And I'm summing over all trajectories which go from I to j, staying inside lambda. Okay, that's very important. So that's the probability that xk, so I'm starting from I, that xk is equal to j, and I have not yet exited the box. So that's just a representation for this. But now we have seen in this lemma that we just proved that this guy here, so this, is certainly smaller than pi tau lambda c is larger than k. And this we have seen this is smaller than E minus ck. Okay? So in particular, when k goes to infinity, this guy goes to 0. So this guy goes to 0 when k goes to infinity. And moreover, the series of the P lambda k is convergent because this decays exponentially fast. So this means that we can take the limit n to infinity in this identity. So let me call this star. Take n to infinity in star. And what we get is that I lambda minus P lambda times the sum from k larger or equal to 0 of p lambda k. Okay. This is equal to I lambda. This guy vanished. This series just gives me this. Okay. Okay. So I've constructed explicitly the inverse of I lambda minus p lambda, because if I take this matrix here and I multiply on the left by I lambda minus p lambda, I get I lambda, but obviously this commutes because p lambda commutes with p lambda and p lambda commutes with the identity, so it's also true if I take the product in the other direction. So this implies that the sum k greater or equal to 0, p lambda k is the inverse, okay, is equal to I lambda minus p lambda. Okay, so the inverse of this matrix, and I claim that this is just what is written here. You just have to use the formula we have written down for the case power of p. Let's just conclude. So this implies that we are note, of course, the sum k greater or equal to 0 p lambda k, say ij. This is just the sum k greater or equal to 0, and then p lambda k ij is just this, so it's a probability I x k equal to j tau lambda c is larger than k. So that's just the same as the expectation starting from I, from k, which goes from 0 to tau lambda c minus 1 of the indicator of xk equal to j, which is g lambda ij. Okay. So nothing very deep and difficult here. But note that it completely solves the first part of our problem, because it tells you that the covariance matrix of your Gaussian measure is just given by so it tells you, we know now that the covariance under the measure in lambda with m equal to 0, any boundary condition eta of phi, say phi I, phi j, well, this is by what we've done, this is g lambda ij. Okay. So it's given by this expression for the Green function of the simple random walk. Okay. Note that this guy depends on lambda, of course, but does not depend on the boundary condition. Okay. It's interesting. Does not depend on the boundary condition. The mean, of course, will depend on the boundary condition, so let's turn to the mean. Need a piece of chalk. So that's everything I wanted to say. Now, what about the mean? So the case of the mean is settled in lemma 723. It tells you the following. So the unique solution to the massless Dirichlet problem is given by, so with bound in lambda with boundary condition eta, is given by the following expression. So the expression is ugly, but it's very simple. So it's so ui is equal to the expected value. So I take my random walk. So I explain it at the same time. So I have lambda here, I have I somewhere. I want to compute the value of the mean at the point I. So I run my random walk starting from I. So let's run the random walk starting from I, so it's running. And at some point it exits the box. Okay, what I do is I look at the value of the boundary condition here. So boundary condition is given by eta, and what is this point? It's the point x,
the position of my random walk at the time where it exits the box, so tau lambda c.
A lot of indices, but
so and then you just take the expected value of this. Okay, x tau lambda c
for all I in lambda.
Actually, for all I in Z.
You can compute this. Okay. So let's prove. Okay, it's very simple, of course. We have to show that this expression here solves the Dirichlet problem. Okay. We know already that there is a unique solution. If I show that it solves the Dirichlet problem, then it's the solution of the Dirichlet problem. Yes, I have enough time. Okay, so proof. Let's first assume that J is not takes J not in lambda, and let's compute Uj. So Uj, by the formula I've just given, okay, it's the expectation starting from J of the position of the walk at the time where it exits the box lambda. Yes. Oh, sorry. Eta of x of too many indices, so getting confused. Eta x tau lambda c. Okay. So now J, by assumption, it's not in lambda. So what is the first time where the walk is not in lambda? Well, it's time 0. Okay, it's already not in lambda at time 0. So tau lambda c is equal to 0, almost surely. So this is the expectation of eta x0, but x0 is just j under this measure with probability 1. So this is just eta j. So indeed, uj is equal to eta j, so it satisfies the boundary condition we want. Okay. So now we still have to show that it's harmonic inside lambda. So now let's do it. So let I in lambda, and let's compute ui. So ui is just the expected value of eta x tau lambda c, starting from I. And now I want to use the only, okay, there are not many things you can do. So you want to use Markov property. So this is just the sum over all j neighboring I. Expectation of I under ei that of eta x tau lambda c, given that the first step x1 is at j times the probability starting at I that at time 1 I'm at j. Okay, just not done anything yet. And then this, okay, let me just write it here because it's so trivial. So this by the Markov property, this is just the expected value starting at j of the same thing. Expected value starting at j of eta x tau lambda complement multiplied by, and what is this? Well, there is a probability 1 over 2d of jumping to this thing, and then I forgot the sum over j, okay, j neighboring I. So what is this? This is 1 over 2d times the sum over j neighbors of I, uj. So what do I get if I subtract, okay, what was my notation? It was u index. So if I subtract ui from both sides, I get that 0 is equal to the Laplacian of u. And so u is harmonic. So this proves the formula for the mean. So we have completely characterized now our Gaussian process. We know its covariance matrix, we know its mean. So this shows that the expected value, yes, okay, whatever, lambda m equals 0, eta of phi I, say, for some I in lambda. Say. This is given by EI. The notation are not very good because I'm not able to draw many different types of different type of blackboard board. Okay. The indices are not the same, so they identify the measure. So this is the expected value for the random walk started at I of eta x tau lambda c.
So we know the covariance matrix, and we know the mean, so we know everything about our Gaussian vector. Okay, that's one good thing. Now, how much time do I have? 5 minutes? Let's just see what you can extract from this. I will continue next week on this topic, and we'll look at the massive model also, but let me already stress some consequences of what we have derived here. So as you will see in exercises, there is one nice thing with this. Okay, maybe I'll explain next week, but I'll motivate now. So the main motivation for me to discuss the Gaussian free field in this course, okay, in addition to the fact that you will see it and you will need these things for the next semester, it's because it's a very simple model in which the spins are unbounded. So before in the Ising model it was plus minus 1, the Potts model to just take bounded number of values, the XY model where you take, or the ON model where you take value on the n sphere. These are all bounded spin models, and for all these models it's trivial that infinite volume Gibbs measure always exist. It's trivial by compactness. You can make a very general compactness argument to show that you always have infinite volume Gibbs states, always. Here you have unbounded spins, so it's not at all trivial that indeed you have an infinite volume Gibbs state. Okay? You cannot apply a compactness argument because the spin space is not compact. So indeed, what we will see next week, I will explain this next week, is that in low dimension, dimension 1 and 2, actually, if you take the limit of increasing boxes lambda, let lambda go to ZD in dimension 1 or 2, you will not get a well-defined measure in the end. There is no infinite volume Gibbs state. From an intuitive point of view, what will happen, what we will see is that, let me draw it in dimension 1. So in dimension 1, let's say you put zero boundary condition, just for illustration, I will discuss this in more detail next week, and in a box of size n, then what happens is that, so this is, here you have just a random walk, a Gaussian random walk. I mean, the steps are just given by Gaussian random variable, so a Gaussian random walk pinned at 0 here and there. And what will be its fluctuation here in the middle of the box? Well, the fluctuation will be given by root n. Of the order of the fluctuation will be root n. Okay? Like for a random walk, a usual random walk which is not pinned at the end, still it's root n, the fluctuation. So in particular, when n goes to infinity, the interface, if you are sitting here at the origin and looking at your interface, when the box becomes very large, with probability 1, the interface is either going infinitely above you, infinitely far above you, or infinitely far below you. You will never see it in the limit n goes to infinity. Because the probability that it ends up in a finite interval is going to 0 when n is going to infinity. So the field will not exist in the limit just because the interface will delocalize to plus or minus infinity. Okay? And exactly the same kind of things also happen in dimension 2, as you will see next week, except that the divergence is much milder. Instead of having a typical height which is of order root n in the middle of the box, like in dimension 1, you have a typical height which is of order square root of log n. The square root of log n is still going to infinity with n. So again, you will have that the interface in dimension 2 is infinitely above you or infinitely far below you, and you will never see it. So there is no limiting state in dimension 2 either. Only starting from dimension 3, you have an infinite volume Gibbs state. So that was my main motivation to discuss this, because in general, it's not so easy to study these problems. But in the Gaussian case, there is one very nice feature, is that all your model in finite lambda, they are all Gaussian random vectors. And it's very easy to check, and you will do that in exercises, that if you have a sequence of Gaussian random vectors, then this sequence of Gaussian random vectors converges if and only if the means converges and the covariance matrix converge. Okay? And then the limit is given by a Gaussian random field which has the limiting mean and the limiting covariance matrix. Okay, so it's very easy to analyze the thermodynamic limit for Gaussian fields because you just have to look at the mean and the covariance matrix, which is much simpler than all local functions and things like that. Okay, so that's what we will do next week. Are there questions about what we did today? No, good.